the developing cultures in Europe. Again, if these notes are not posted on the website, I'll make sure that I get them up there fairly soon, and I'll post the audio here a little bit later today as well. Okay? So, cultural norms of the barbarians. Alright, another political cartoon for us to take a look at. To get us started, what do you think the artist is implying in this particular case here with this political cartoon? Ideas? Yes.
They didn't have lights.
They didn't have lights. What does light symbolize in this concept of the Dark Age?
Peace.
Peace, okay. Could be a part of it.
Not fighting.
Not fighting could be a part of it. Yeah?
Knowledge.
What's that?
Knowledge.
Knowledge, right? Advanced civilization, culture, art, literature, right? The great things that we take for granted that we really appreciate are leisure activities. Aspects we think about the Minoans, their ability to focus on appearance, right? We focus a lot on appearance. That's reflective of our high society, advanced civilization. So that would be light. What else is the artist trying to say here? Ms. Carlson?
That there's no other option.
There's no other option. How do you know that there's no other option?
Because there's not on.
There's not an on. It's just off or off, right? Doesn't matter. It's inevitable is what they're saying here, okay? Now, a lot of times when you talk to historians, they don't like to use that word inevitable. They always like to say that, that history could have been different, that changes could have been made, and things could have gone a different direction, right? But from this particular artist's perspective, when Rome fell apart, the Germanic tribes that ended up taking over the region of Western Europe, their cultural characteristics in comparison to what Rome had is like going backwards, down, right? The ladder of civilization, like we talked about before, okay? So that's what followed the fall of the western portion of the Roman Empire. It's the second Dark Age that we looked at. You remember Rome is all about life in the cities and how advanced that would be. We talked about life in having these public baths, the aqueducts, having sewage or sewers to get the sewage out, indoor plumbing, all that good stuff. And then when the barbarians lead the overthrow of the western portion of the Roman Empire, what happens? All these cities start to go away, right? These large metropolitan areas start to disappear. You revert to an agrarian type of lifestyle, and things go a little bit backward that way, okay? So our bellwether question, how did the barbarians contribute to it? Our first slide here kind of answers that. A couple of the points for us to think about. Rome lost control over the Germanic tribes. This relationship of paying them off is reflective of that losing control over them. The Germanic tribes began to move freely. They allowed them inside the Roman Empire. They moved freely within the empire. And then more movement led to more attacks. Okay, more attacks led to the downfall of the western portion of the Roman Empire. Okay, so I like these images down here at the bottom, at least these over here. Kind of reflects the stereotype of a barbarian that was highlighted in the documentary yesterday. What's wrong with that stereotype that all barbarians are scantily clad, people that don't wear very many clothes? What's wrong with that stereotype, that perception there? It's completely wrong because, yeah, they come from the northern portions of Europe. It's cold up there. They're not going to walk around half clothed up there, That's just completely wrong, okay? So make sure that you change your perception of what a barbarian looks like. And they got more clothes on than that. right? Causes of migration. Why were these Germanic tribes, these barbarian groups, why were they moving from place to place throughout Europe? Okay, one additional idea here beyond the items that are up here. There's a theory. It's called the cue ball theory. You may want to write that out. You're going to get exposed to that in our documentary a little bit later today, hopefully. The cue ball theory is like, or billiard ball theory. Sometimes it's called that as well. You guys played pool before, right? You got a white cue ball and you hit it and it shatters the rest of the balls on the table, right? Okay. The idea here is that there was one particular Germanic tribe that was the cue ball, right? And when they moved, everybody else moved. You may know what that particular group would be. They're pretty rough and tough and scary. Give you a guess, or give you a hint to begin with an H. Yep. The Huns. Yep, be the Huns. So you may write Huns out to the side of billiard ball, cue ball theory. Okay. There are other reasons for causes of migration for the Germanic tribes. Weather, climate. The farther south that you go, the warmer the weather. Their agrarian-based type of lifestyle, better weather for planting crops, right? The availability of money. If you attack the Roman Empire enough, then they would develop this arrangement, this agreement. They'd pay you off, and you would acquire wealth that way. Last thing was there was available land. Inside the Roman Empire, there was available land to be occupied. Okay? Germanic social divisions. This was highlighted in the documentary again yesterday as well. You have 3 social classes, and very common to these Germanic groups, these barbarian cultures, that you would have a class of warriors, which is pretty much what we think about with the stereotypical barbarian, a warrior class. They would have a class of priests, which is a little bit different from aspects of Christianity that the Romans had acquired at that point in time. And then they had peasants as well, laborers. Okay, so you did have a class-based system in these Germanic tribes. It wasn't like a classless society of a hunting and gathering society like the stereotype of barbarians would suggest. Okay, the contingent nature of the barbarian movement. This is maybe phrased in a complex way, but it's pretty important stuff. The migration of these Germanic tribes eventually laid the groundwork, the foundations for the countries of Europe that we have today. Right? The people groups and the nations in Europe that we have today are really contingent upon where these barbarian groups ended up. All right, as they were bouncing around, migrating throughout Europe at the end of the Roman Empire. Okay, I like this imagery here because it shows you a progression of the Roman Empire and how it's growing. You can see the dates down at the bottom. See how big it is? It encompasses the entirety of the Mediterranean at one point in time. And then we get to, just a second there. What happened? You got blue and green. Splits into 2, right? Who's the guy that did that? Diocletian did. Diocletian divided, said it's too big for one man, right? And so he divided it into 2. And then, if you're following it back then, what happened fairly shortly after they split it up into 2, what happened to the western portion? It pretty much fell apart much quicker than the eastern portion. What's the eastern portion's name? You did the 10 head on it the other day? The Byzantine Empire. The Byzantium. Okay? Constantine was a big part of that. This is kind of reflective of that idea of the contingent nature of the migrating tribes. Right? Kind of mentioned this a little bit with our bell work as well. The Franks and the Burgundians, they migrated down to the region of Gaul, which is pretty much France today. Right? So the Franks, the Burgundians, become the French culture. The Angles and the Saxons, they migrated farther west towards the region of England, and so they set up the foundation for what we have as the English culture today. Sound good? Some pictures from these different regions. What's this right here? The Eiffel Tower. And where's the Eiffel Tower found? In Paris, right? Paris, France. What's this? Stonehenge. And where's Stonehenge found? Not Easter Island, no. Similar idea, but no. That would be in England as well. Okay, that's why you got Anglo-Saxons in England. All right, cultural characteristics of the barbarians. They had tribal law, and so this differs greatly from Rome. Rome had a republic, right? You had an assembly, you had council members, you had emperors at certain points in time, balance of power, very specific, a lot of rules. They had the 12 tables that they were governed by, written rules, right? Very civilized in their political system. And the barbarians, they didn't have any of that, right? No established form of government. Everything was based upon oral contracts, so your verbal commitment on things, that's how things were decided. And then the third concept we're going to break down a little bit more. If you had disputes because of the subjective nature of the oral contracts, they had a way of resolving them. They don't have like a court system like we have. They have a system, this idea that they call a trial by ordeal. Maybe out to the side of trial by ordeal, the big component in this idea, method of resolving conflict is really the role of a divine being, right? The role of a divine being. So at certain times, these Germanic tribes eventually acquired the Christian faith, and so that would be the Christian God at certain times. At other times, it would be their other gods that they'd worshipped previous to acquiring Christianity. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple of these trial by ordeal, and I got to pull up my notes to make sure I give you a better explanation of them. And to give you an idea of how they worked, you have trial by ordeal by fire. So if you had a conflict with an individual, say that they get accused of stealing something, the accused would walk over plowshares, like pieces of metal, like plates of metal, and then these plowshares, actually before they walked over them, they would be heated up so that they're like red hot. Sound good? And then you'd have to walk over top of them. So inevitably, what's going to happen to your feet? Yeah, you're going to have one heck of a wound. Okay, so the idea is that you would have a wound, and then the wound over the course of time would be interpreted by a priest from the barbarian group, and then they would ask the priest to decide whether God had intervened or the barbarian divine being had intervened on the behalf of the accused or not, based on the interpretation of the healing wound. Everybody got it? So if the wound was assumed to be healing, then the accused would be assumed to be what? Innocent. But if they termed it festering, right, that's the terminology that they use. If it's festering and it's not healing itself, then the assumption is that the accused is what? Guilty then, okay? All right, trial by ordeal by water. A couple different variations of this with water. Hot water, boiling hot. They would put it into a kettle, boiling hot, and then they put a stone in the bottom of that kettle, right? And it would be, about, I bet, 5 gallons of water, something like that, in that kettle. You have to reach all the way in and grab that stone. What's going to happen to your arm? Yeah, you're going to burn your arm again. The wounds would be bandaged. After 3 days, they would take a look at your wounds. And again, same idea with the plowshares and the fire. Has the divine being of the barbaric group intervened in the healing process, or is it festering? Again, if it's festering, you're assumed to be guilty. Another variation of water, and this mostly associated with witches, and the idea that somebody would be accused of witchcraft. Witches were thought to have supernatural ability of floating. They didn't understand the concept of swimming, I guess, at this point in time, right? So they assumed that witches had the ability to float. So if you floated, you were considered to be guilty, and if you sank, you were considered to be innocent. Ironically, if you sank, the likelihood of you surviving is probably not so good. So witches were also considered to be incapable of being baptized. Baptize is a method of being dunked underwater. So they assumed that witches couldn't be baptized because they were thought to have sold their soul to the devil for their supernatural abilities. So again, that contributes to this idea of them floating. So one way to give them the trial by ordeal associated with witchcraft, you throw them into water. If they floated, the assumption is that they were a witch. If they didn't float, the assumption is that they weren't a witch. Sound good? So an interesting concept there. By cross. Both the accused and the accuser were forced to participate to decrease the number of accusations. The participants had to stand with their arms raised in a cross-like fashion like this. The first one to drop their arms lost. So it's a fairly simple task there. The idea in this particular case would be the divine being would intervene on the behalf of the innocent, and they would be able to defeat the accused there in that situation. Sound good? Later on, they got rid of that type of trial by ordeal, especially after they acquired the concept of Christianity because it defied the symbol of the cross. Last one, by food and ingestion. Again, this is later on, and so the assumption is that they had acquired the concept of Christianity at this point in time. They would ingest food, and if they choked on the bread or the cheese that they were ingesting, they'd assumed to be guilty. If they didn't choke, then they would be assumed to be innocent. Other times they'd be given a Eucharist. A Eucharist is a piece of bread associated with the crucifixion and the body of Jesus. And the assumption is if they died within the next year, then they were assumed to be guilty. If they didn't die, then they were assumed to be innocent there. So in all of these trial by ordeal, you can see the key role is the intervention of a divine being. Sound good? All right, last concept before we get back to our documentary for a few moments. Comitatus. Comitatus is a concept that's rooted in the barbarian culture, but it's the predecessor to feudalism. So I want to make sure that you emphasize feudalism. Feudalism is the land-based social system that dominates the medieval time period. Right? So where does feudalism come? The ideas for feudalism, they actually originate from the barbarian culture's ideas of comitatus. So make sure that you understand that comitatus and feudalism are really almost one and the same. It's the development of this like oral contract, honorable relationship between a lord and vassal, and essentially, again, that's what feudalism is. Okay, so you would have a person of lesser wealth, a peasant, pay homage to somebody of wealthier means, like a baron or lord, and they would pledge loyalty to them, and in return, they would work the land for them that way. Sound good? Again, that's the basis of feudalism. I believe that is it. Questions about the characteristics of the barbarian groups? All right, let's get back to our document. Go ahead and pull back up the discussion forum.